Ethan had been on the planet for weeks now, studying alien wildlife and ecosystems, a task that should have been exhilarating for a young explorer like himself. Yet, after an exhausting day trekking through the dense jungle-like forests, he was glad to retreat to his quarters on the space station. His body ached from the day's work, and all he wanted was a hot shower, a meal, and a good night's sleep. Simple pleasures, right? But as he entered his quarters, a thought briefly crossed his mind. The door, he had left it wide open. He was too tired to care. After all, who would be wandering around the station at this hour? The last thing on his mind was the possibility of his next-door neighbor, Zara, noticing his oversight. Zara, a diplomat's sister, alien royalty in her own right, and someone who always seemed so far beyond his reach. In the days he'd spent on the station, he noticed her, the way she walked with perfect poise, the sharpness in her eyes, and the almost aloof air that surrounded her. If he were being honest, Zara had always made him feel like a bumbling fool. She was brilliant, composed, and just out of his league in every way. As Ethan walked into the bathroom, preparing to shower, Zara was in the middle of her own struggle. She was in heat, something she'd been trying to hide, not just from him, but from everyone on the station. Her species was known for their pheromones, which were capable of affecting humans in intense ways, especially during their mating cycle. The effects were potent and often uncontrollable. Zara knew she had to keep herself in check, avoid anyone who might be triggered by her heat, especially a human like Ethan, who had no idea what he was walking into. But Ethan had no idea. He was too busy mentally preparing himself for the inevitable awkwardness of seeing Zara again. He'd been trying to avoid her for days now, hoping to keep his awkwardness under wraps. The last thing he needed was for Zara to catch him flustered and make him the subject of one of her sharp-witted comments. What he didn't realize was that Zara had noticed the open door as soon as she stepped into the hallway. With a sly grin, she couldn't resist the temptation. She knew exactly what her pheromones would do to him. It wasn't malicious, just a bit of fun, at least in her eyes. The first whiff of Zara's scent hit Ethan as he turned off the water in the bathroom. It wasn't just any scent, it was intoxicating, like a strange mixture of sweet, spicy, and something else, something undeniably alluring. He froze for a second, his body reacting before his mind could process what was happening. His heart rate picked up, and his instincts screamed at him to leave, but his body refused to listen. He could feel the heat rise to his cheeks, his pulse quickening. It was almost like he couldn't escape it. Every instinct told him to turn around, to find the source of this overwhelming attraction. And then, just as he was trying to regain control, Zara appeared in the doorway, standing there with a knowing smile. She didn't need to say anything to him. Her mere presence seemed to electrify the air. She could see the way he was breathing more quickly, the way his body was reacting. A glint of amusement sparked in her eyes. "You look like you're having trouble breathing," Zara said, her voice smooth, almost teasing. "Is the air a little thick in here, or is it just me?" Ethan's brain struggled to catch up to what was happening, but his body was a different story. His chest heaved with every breath, and his mind raced to figure out how to act normal. But of course, normal wasn't even an option at this point. He could feel his heart pounding harder as Zara's words hung in the air, thick with double meanings. He tried to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. No, I'm fine. Just didn't expect to see you," Ethan stammered, his words coming out more flustered than he intended. He tried to back up, to find some space between them, but his feet betrayed him, and he only ended up stepping closer to her. Zara, not at all fazed, crossed her arms, and with a hint of a smirk, she stepped forward, clearly enjoying the effect she was having on him. "Oh? Did I surprise you? I suppose the door being wide open was an invitation of sorts," she said, her voice taking on a playful edge. The way she said "invitation" made Ethan feel like she was speaking directly to him, as though she knew exactly what her presence was doing to him. The teasing in her tone was undeniable, and yet she remained so calm, so in control, like she had done this 1,000 times before. Ethan stumbled backward, awkwardly trying to distance himself, but it was no use. The pheromones in the air had him in a vice grip. Every part of his body was responding to them, and his mind was barely holding on. He knew he had to say something, anything, to get out of this situation, but nothing coherent came out. I wasn't expecting you to be, here, he muttered, kicking himself internally. Zara tilted her head, watching him with an almost clinical amusement. You didn't expect me to be here? But you left your door wide open. It's almost as if you were hoping for a little company. The insinuation in her words hit him like a ton of bricks. His brain screamed at him to back out of the room, to leave, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights, but his body had different plans. The scent was making it impossible to think straight, and Zara's teasing only made it worse. Zara noticed his discomfort, and though it would have been easy to push further, she opted to play it cool. Relax, Ethan. I'm not here to make things harder for you. Just take a breath, okay? You'll figure it out, she said with a wink before turning to leave. Ethan stood there for a moment, his chest still rising and falling rapidly, trying to process what just happened. His mind kept flashing between confusion, embarrassment, and an overwhelming desire to understand what was going on. But Zara's last words echoed in his head. You'll figure it out. And in that moment, he realized one thing. He was far from figuring this out, and he wasn't sure if he ever would. As she disappeared into the hallway, leaving the door still wide open behind her, Ethan finally let out a shaky breath. I really shouldn't have left that door open. Ethan stumbled back into his quarters, his mind spinning. Zara's words, her teasing, and most of all, her pheromones were still swirling around in his head. The air was thick with the lingering scent, and he couldn't seem to shake it. His rational mind was trying to convince him that he should simply walk away, maybe pretend it never happened. But his body wasn't listening. Every nerve in him was on fire, and despite himself, his mind kept replaying the moment she'd stepped into the room. It was as if he couldn't escape the pull of her presence, even though everything in him screamed that he needed to. He quickly tried to do something, anything, to distract himself, his hands reaching for the datapad on his desk, his mind trying to engage with something familiar. He needed some semblance of control, to focus on something else. Anything but this ridiculous situation. But as he read through the data reports of his day, Zara's voice echoed in his mind. You can't handle the heat, but I bet you'd like to try. The words sent a wave of heat straight through his body. He didn't know whether to be embarrassed, annoyed, or just plain confused. He had no idea what was going on anymore. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was a professional, a trained explorer. He didn't get flustered like this. Yet here he was, his body betraying him at every turn, and the only thing he could focus on was the memory of Zara's eyes, her confidence, the way she toyed with him without even breaking a sweat. Just as his thoughts started to spiral into a whirlpool of embarrassment, there was a knock at the door. Ethan froze. He hadn't locked the door. He hadn't even thought about it. Of course, he hadn't. He was too distracted by the way Zara had affected him. For a moment, he debated ignoring it, but then the door slid open on its own. The figure that entered wasn't Zara. No, this time it was one of the station's senior officers. His uniform, neat and crisp, contrasted starkly with Ethan's disheveled state. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, and Ethan felt the weight of scrutiny upon him. Mr. Ethan, I trust everything is in order? The officer asked, his tone formal, though there was an unmistakable undertone of suspicion. Ethan gulped, trying his hardest to look composed. Yeah, everything's fine. Just a long day out in the field, you know? His voice cracked slightly, and he immediately cursed himself for sounding so weak. He cursed the fact that Zara's pheromones were still filling the room, taunting him. The officer didn't seem convinced, his eyes flicking around the room. We've been monitoring the situation, he said, his tone implying there was more than just routine surveillance involved. There are reports of unusual behavior between you and Ms. Zara. His eyes settled on Ethan, as if daring him to lie. We need to know what's going on. Ethan's mind raced, but he kept his expression blank. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. Sure, he knew his job as an explorer might occasionally put him in awkward situations with the aliens of this planet, but this? This was beyond anything he could have prepared for. He was just trying to get through the day without embarrassing himself too much. Reports? He asked, the words slipping out before he could stop it. He'd been too busy focusing on the immediate problem of Zara's teasing and his own physical reactions to even think that the higher-ups might be aware of anything unusual. Of course, they had sensors everywhere. The officer nodded grimly. Yes. We've been monitoring the environmental changes in the station, and we've detected fluctuations in the atmosphere. Particularly around your quarters. Is there something you'd like to share? Ethan's brain went into overdrive. He couldn't admit what had really happened. Not with his commanding officer standing there, looking at him with such suspicion. I don't know. Maybe it's just the new environment. You know, different atmospheres, strange effects on the body. Nothing to be concerned about. Ethan stammered, praying it would sound believable. The officer's eyes narrowed further, as if considering whether or not to buy his explanation. I see, he said after a pause, his gaze flicking to the open door and then back to Ethan. Well, I trust you'll keep your behavior in check, Mr. Ethan. We don't want any further incidents. Understand? Ethan nodded quickly, his throat dry. Of course, of course. No problems here. The officer gave him one last look, clearly unconvinced, before nodding curtly and leaving the room, the door sliding shut behind him. Ethan exhaled in relief, but the relief was short-lived. He still felt the pressure building in his chest, the heat radiating through him. And Zara's words echoed once again in his head. As he tried to calm his nerves, the door slid open again. This time, it wasn't the officer. It was Zara herself, standing in the doorway with an almost wicked grin on her face. The scent that wafted in with her was like a hammer to his senses, and he knew immediately that there was no escape. You really should be more careful, Ethan, she said, her voice smooth and teasing. Leaving your door open like that, it's practically an invitation. She stepped in, her presence filling the space, making it feel like everything was closing in on him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he tried to speak but couldn't find the words. His body was already reacting, and he knew there was no denying what was happening anymore. It was like she had complete control over him, and the worst part was that he didn't even mind. Now I'm curious, Zara continued, walking closer, her eyes never leaving his face. Do you really think you can handle it? You've been so good at avoiding me until now, but that door. She pointed to the open door. You left it wide open for me. The double meaning in her words hit him hard, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse right there. Zara, however, didn't seem to be in any rush. She stood before him, waiting for his response, her eyes gleaming with amusement. Ethan struggled to pull himself together, but it was hard when everything in him wanted to just give in, to let her take the lead. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing, but when he finally spoke, it was with a shaky voice. Zara. I don't know what you're talking about. Her laughter was soft but full of mischief. Oh, I think you do. You're just pretending you don't. But don't worry, Ethan. I won't make you admit it. Not yet, anyway. And just like that, she turned, walking out of the room with a final, teasing glance over her shoulder. You'll figure it out, Ethan. You always do. Ethan stood there, completely stunned. His breath was still coming in short gasps, and he realized something with a growing sense of dread. No, he hadn't figured it out yet. And by the way Zara was acting, he wasn't sure if he ever would. Ethan sat down on his bed, his mind spinning. The room felt smaller now, with Zara's presence still lingering in the air, and the heat in his body refusing to subside. The way she looked at him, the way she talked, it was as if she knew exactly what effect she had on him. And it wasn't just the pheromones, no, that was just part of it. It was her confidence, her complete control over the situation. He couldn't focus. Every thought seemed to be clouded by the memories of the past few moments. His heart was still racing, his body still reacting, and the worst part was that he wasn't entirely sure if he wanted it to stop. Part of him, some deeper part, was enjoying this. Maybe it was the excitement, the danger of it, but it was also the way Zara made him feel completely out of his element. He'd always prided himself on being in control, but now, in her presence, he was a mess. There was a knock at the door again. Ethan groaned inwardly. He had a feeling it wasn't going to be the officer this time. He barely had a moment to prepare before the door slid open and there she was, Zara, standing just outside the threshold, her eyes glinting with amusement. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that knowledge made him feel even more exposed. "Another knock at the door, Ethan," she said, her voice low and teasing. "I'm starting to think you want me to come in." Ethan's mind scrambled for an appropriate response, but his voice failed him. Instead, he stared at her, the heat building once again in his chest, an overwhelming sensation he couldn't explain. Zara stood there for a moment, studying him with that same calculating look, before she stepped inside, her eyes never leaving his face. "You're looking a little flushed," she said casually, the teasing tone in her voice impossible to ignore. "I told you, you wouldn't be able to resist for long." Ethan could feel his pulse quickening again, and he tried desperately to keep his composure. He wanted to say something smart, something to regain control, but the words didn't come. He couldn't seem to think straight with her standing there, close enough that he could smell her. Her scent was unmistakable, potent, intoxicating. I'm not sure what's going on," he said, his voice shaky, the words coming out wrong even as they left his mouth. "I didn't ask for this." Zara didn't look offended. If anything, she looked even more amused. "No one ever asks for it, Ethan. That's the beauty of it." She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she knew exactly how her presence was affecting him. "But you're here now, aren't you? So, let's not pretend you don't know exactly what's going on." Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wasn't sure if he was angry, embarrassed, or just confused. Zara's presence had disarmed him completely. The way she moved, the way she spoke, it all felt so foreign, yet so real, and it was starting to make him question his own reactions. "You're not exactly handling this well," Zara continued, her voice smooth as velvet. "But I guess I can't blame you. You're only human after all." There was a slight pause, a beat where Ethan felt as if he might suffocate under the weight of her gaze. But instead of breaking, Zara stepped back and folded her arms, her expression turning thoughtful. "Maybe you need some help," she said, her tone light but with a distinct edge of something more. "Maybe I can teach you how to handle it." Ethan blinked, unsure of how to respond. His mind screamed at him to resist, to find some way to put a stop to this madness, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The pheromones were still there, like a cloud he couldn't escape, and Zara, with her playful, teasing attitude, was making it worse by the second. She tilted her head, as if considering him, and for a moment, Ethan felt like he was being studied, analyzing his reactions, testing his limits. "You don't seem like the type to let something like this slide," she said, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "But maybe that's the problem. You're so used to controlling everything, aren't you?" It felt like a punch to the gut. She was right. He had always prided himself on his control. Everything in his life was organized, structured, precise. But here, with Zara, nothing made sense. She had thrown him completely off balance, and he didn't know how to fight it. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't lose control like this, not with her, not now. He had to find a way out, had to get back to his normal self. But Zara wasn't done. She stepped closer once more, this time reaching out to brush her fingers against his arm, a simple touch, but it sent an electric jolt through him. "You're not going to run away this time, are you?" she asked softly, her voice low and inviting. "You've already started something, Ethan. Might as well see it through." It was a challenge, and Ethan felt every inch of it. He wanted to walk away, to escape, but there was something about the way Zara spoke, something about her control, that made him hesitate. Every part of him screamed that he should resist, but another part, the part that had been quietly burning ever since she entered his room, wanted to let go. Just once. Zara! He muttered, trying to find his footing. His voice cracked, and he cursed under his breath. This isn't what I wanted. Her smile widened, and she tilted her head in a way that made him feel even smaller. I know, she said, her tone full of something darkly amused. But sometimes, Ethan, we don't always get what we want. Sometimes the universe gives us something different. The air between them thickened. There was a charged silence, the weight of Zara's words hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Ethan felt the heat rise in his chest once again, his body betraying him as he tried to process what was happening. I can't, he said again, though his voice was weaker this time, uncertain. I don't know how to deal with this. Zara took another step closer, and this time, when she spoke, her voice was even lower, more intimate. I think you do, Ethan. I think you've known all along. You just didn't want to admit it. Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. All of his arguments, all of his defenses, melted away in the face of her certainty. He was no longer sure what was real, what was happening, and what was just the pheromones, playing with his mind. But one thing was clear, he was caught in her web, and he had no idea how to break free. You'll figure it out, she whispered, leaning in close enough that he could feel her breath against his skin. Eventually. And then she was gone. Ethan stood there, stunned, completely alone again. The air felt colder now, emptier. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and he wasn't sure if it was the lingering effects of Zara's presence, or something deeper, something that had shifted inside him. He collapsed back onto the bed, his mind racing. The door was still wide open, but it didn't matter anymore. There was no escaping this. The heat, the tension, the games, they weren't going away. And he wasn't sure if he even wanted them to. Ethan's thoughts churned, as chaotic as a storm in his mind. He hadn't expected any of this. In fact, he hadn't even been prepared to confront the overwhelming pull that Zara had on him. She had crossed a line, no, several lines, but now, here he was, caught in a whirlwind that he couldn't control. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his pulse still racing from the encounter. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air too thick, too charged, still tinged with the scent of her. He couldn't escape it. It was clear now that Zara wasn't just playing games with him. This was deliberate, calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing. And the worst part was, Ethan didn't know how to get out of it. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to escape the web she was weaving around him, but his body refused to listen. It was as if the pheromones she'd unleashed had taken control of him, clouding his thoughts, twisting his senses until he couldn't think straight. The more he tried to regain control, the more it slipped away. He could feel it in the way his heart raced at the mere thought of her, in the heat that still clung to his skin. His breath was uneven, his chest rising and falling with each attempt to calm himself, but it wasn't working. He had no control over his reactions, and that terrified him. How had she done this? How had she reduced him to this state of confusion and frustration? He tried to focus on something, anything, to distract himself. His fingers brushed over the data pad on his bedside table, and he began to scroll through the reports he'd gathered from his exploration. But the words blurred in front of him, the sentences no longer making sense. His thoughts kept wandering back to her, to the way her eyes had locked with his, to the way she had pushed him, challenged him, without even trying. Zara had known from the start that this wasn't just about pheromones. It was about power, control. It was about testing him, breaking him down bit by bit until she held every piece of him in her hands. And she knew he was helpless against it. He wasn't sure if he hated her for it, or if he hated himself even more for not being able to resist. There was a knock at the door, and for a moment, Ethan's heart stopped. Was it her again? Was Zara back to torment him some more, to push him even further than she already had? He couldn't handle another encounter like the last one. He couldn't bear it. But when the door slid open, it wasn't Zara. It was one of the station's officers, the one who had questioned him earlier, walking in with a stern look on his face. "Mr. Ethan," the officer said, his voice as formal as ever. "We need to have a word." Ethan sat up, his stomach twisting. He knew what this was about. The station was onto him, onto what had happened with Zara, and now they were going to make sure he didn't let it get out of hand. He wasn't sure if he was relieved that it wasn't Zara, or if he was just afraid of what this would mean. Either way, his world had been turned upside down in the last few hours, and he wasn't sure he could handle much more. I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan stammered, his mind still hazy from the last encounter. His voice didn't sound like his own, thick with nerves and something else, something he didn't want to admit. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "We've had reports of unusual behavior in your quarters, Mr. Ethan. We've been monitoring your interactions with Ms. Zara. You're not the only one affected by her pheromones, you know." Ethan froze. That's what this was about. The officer wasn't here to check on his well-being. He wasn't here to make sure Ethan was safe. He was here to investigate Zara's influence, on him, on the station, on everyone. "I assure you, nothing happened," Ethan said, his voice a little more confident this time, though his body betrayed him, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm just adjusting to the environment. New planet, new challenges." The officer didn't buy it, of course. "We're aware of that, Mr. Ethan. But you should know that your adjustment is under scrutiny now. There have been too many incidents. We're monitoring everything closely from now on." Ethan felt a bead of sweat trickle down his neck. He was trapped. This wasn't just about his awkwardness with Zara anymore. This was about the fact that the station had noticed him, had seen the way he reacted to her. He didn't know what Zara had done, what games she'd played with him, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "We've also heard reports that you've been involved with Ms. Zara more than you're admitting. Is that true, Mr. Ethan?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Ethan's mouth went dry. He couldn't lie anymore, not when the evidence was all around him, not when the officer's eyes were practically daring him to admit it. "I know," he began, shaking his head. "I haven't done anything with her. I'm just trying to do my job. That's all." The officer studied him for a moment, clearly unconvinced by the excuses. But finally, he seemed to relent. "Fine," he said, stepping back. "But you need to be careful. You're not the only one involved here. If anything happens between you and Ms. Zara, we'll have to take action. Understood?" Ethan nodded quickly, his heart hammering in his chest. "Understood." The officer turned and left without another word, leaving Ethan to sit there, his mind racing. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep pretending like Zara wasn't playing with him, like he wasn't falling for her games. The more he tried to fight it, the more he found himself drawn to her. And now, the station was watching him too. He collapsed back onto the bed, staring at the ceiling once again, as his mind spun with the realization of just how deep he was in this mess. Zara's presence, her pheromones, the control she had over him, it was all too much. But somehow, some part of him, the part he hated most, wanted more. He wasn't sure if he could ever escape this. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to.